Well, hello everybody and welcome to my YouTube channel. Emma Desi here bringing you another amazing interview. And today's interview is with the lovely Matty Dalrymple. Hello, Matty.
Hello, how are you doing?
Very well. I'm very excited to have you here today. Before we jump into the sort of heart of our conversation today, I'm just going to let people know a little bit more about you in case they haven't come across you before. But Matty Dalrymple is the author of the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, beginning with the Rock, Paper, Scissors. She's also the author of the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels, beginning with The Sense of Death, and the Ann Kinnear Suspense Shorts. She's a member of International Thriller Writers and Sisters in Crime. Matty also writes, speaks, and consults on the writing craft and the publishing voyage, and shares what she's learned on the Indy Author podcast. Matty has written books on the business of short fiction and podcasting for authors, and her articles have appeared in Writer's Digest magazine, and she is a member of the Alliance of Independent Authors. So you do a lot.
I do. I'm all over the publishing voyage and all associated with it.
You really are. So I take it you are a lover of the thriller novels. Has that sort of always been what you wanted to write as you began this journey towards publishing and writing?
Well, unlike many of the people that I think show up on podcasts, I can't say that, I was writing stories as soon as I could hold a pencil or something like that. But my father was an author, and actually back in the 50s, he had got some short stories published in Collier's and Cosmopolitan, and then he turned his attention to novel writing. I think he just was more of a short story guy than a novel guy at the time. Of course, there wasn't the indie publishing option really for people who are writing. She never got a novel published, but writing was always something that was in his life, and I know that he was happy when it was in mine. I did some short story writing when I was in college, and it was great because he was my agent, so I would just give him the short stories and he would send it out, and I never had to hear about any of the rejections. I only heard
Oh,
got to hear
that's what
when
we
one
all
got
need,
accepted.
don't we? We
Yeah,
all need a little bit of
exactly.
that.
It was, I didn't fully appreciate at the time how what a great thing that was to be buffered from the rejections that were coming in. But I did get I guess at least one story published when I was in college, but then I kind of let it go, and I went many years not doing a lot of writing, working in the corporate world. And then oh, I'm trying to think when it must have been. It must have been 2011 that my husband and I were on vacation at Yellowstone. We were in the Yellowstone Hotel in the national park, and I was telling him about this scene that I had pictured in my mind of a woman who can sense dead people, and she has a business related to that. And she goes to a house. At the time, it was in San Francisco because my sister lived in San Francisco, and I was spending a lot of time there. It was in one of the beautiful old Victorian houses in San Francisco. And she goes to the house, and Anne does not know, but the reader does, that a murder took place there. And that was a scene that became sort of a middle scene of The Sense of Death, the first Ann Kinnear book. And my husband encouraged me to write that up, as we ate dinner at the Yellowstone Hotel. And I wrote that up, and then I had to build a story around it, which wasn't the most efficient way of going about writing a novel. But, 2.5 years later, that came out as The Sense of Death. And then once I had created that world, and once I'd had the experience of writing a novel, I never looked back, and I just wanted to do that more and more. And then in 2019, I left my corporate job and I started writing and publishing full time.
Wow, that's wonderful. That sounds like a great way of doing it. I think that you're sort of the element of your story whereby kind of life took over and pulled you away from writing. That's something I come across quite a lot, particularly with us women. And then maybe there's some kids along the way or whatever, or corporate life, and then we come back to it and enjoy it in the kind of I got criticized for saying the second half of life because but how long is life? But over 40, shall we say, that a lot of people kind of come back to it. And so how was that experience for you, writing that first book, and this was your first novel, I think, be your first novel? How did you find that compared to writing the short stories you'd written when you were back in college?
Well, it was very different. I think when I wrote short stories way back in college, they were more kind of vignettes. I wouldn't say that um, it wasn't like there were intricate plots. The one story that I recall that did get published was about a conversation between a waitress in a diner and a um, trucker who bond over their unusual mutual appreciation of Georgia O'Keeffe. So it was just a conversation, it wasn't a thriller-esque sort of plot. So it was very different writing The Sense of Death. And I didn't have anything to compare it to. So it's kind of hard for me to look back. I was just, I wrote up that one scene that actually probably takes place about maybe a third of the way, maybe a quarter of the way into it, but definitely not the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And it was helpful for me because in doing that, I got to know the character Ann Kinnear. I got to know, as I fleshed that scene out, I got to know a little bit more about some of the people around her. And then I would write other little bits, like I felt like I needed to explain to myself how Anne had come to have this ability and how it had affected her life. So I, wrote a scene about Anne as a child and her parents realizing that she was seeing dead people, and then wrote another scene about a boyfriend who doesn't believe she's actually kind of unbalanced because she thinks she can do this. And then I had to figure out how to work those into a story, a thriller-esque story. So it was lots and lots of trial and error, lots and lots of back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also not knowing whether what I was writing was a standalone or a series. I don't think at the time I was really thinking that this would become a series, at least not at the beginning. So that first novel was definitely not written in any kind of way I would ever recommend anybody to go about it if efficiency is important to you.
But I love that though, because I think it's important for new writers particularly to know that the first book is often the messiest, because we're learning that process and how it
Yeah.
all comes together, and there is a lot of trial and error. And wonderfully, if you are writing a series, this is the opportunity, this is where you get to know, first meet your protagonist and that person you're going to get to know a lot over the course of the series. And I wonder too, when you were writing that first book, it sounds like this was something that you thought, this will be fun to do while I'm on holiday, and then the bug got you. And I wonder, from the beginning, did you have an expectation that, yes, I want to finish this and I want to publish this? Or did it start off as just a sort of passion project at the beginning?
At the very beginning, it was a passion project. I think that I wouldn't have written it with any expectation that then I would finish it and put it in a drawer and then I would be satisfied. Like I figured that when it was done, I was going to try to find a way to find readers for it.
Mhm.
And so when I was finishing it up, I spoke to, and that would have been 2013, I spoke to friends I knew who were traditionally published and asked them, to describe the pros and cons. I talked to friends who are independently published and asked them to describe the pros and cons. And in weighing all that, it just didn't feel appealing to me to go the traditional route at the time. And I think this is even more true today than it was then. You just didn't get that much. Um, that the life of a traditionally published author was not what it had been. Like I spoke with authors in 2013 who had been traditionally published maybe a decade or more before. And they were like, yeah, I used to have, the publisher send a limo to the airport to pick me up when I went to a store for a book signing. And it had been years and years since that had happened. So, in the end, I like to say that the traditional world offers the A and B, which is access in the sense that it's more likely that my traditionally published friends are going to find their books in Barnes and Noble than that I will find my books in Barnes and Noble. Although I think that is becoming less and less the case as more and more outlets open to independently published authors. And then bragging rights, because of course it's cooler to say that your book is out there by Book Couture or Tor or whoever it is than William Kingsfield Publishers. Although I did say that name, I remember the first conference I went to. People asked me who my publisher was, and I would say I'm independently published. At the time, I probably said self-published, and we can talk about why I don't say that anymore if you want to. But I finally got tired of the looks I got. So the next person who asked me, I said, William Kingsfield Publishers. And he was like, oh, yeah, I've heard of them. I'm like, no, you haven't. But
That's brilliant. I love that. I think that says so much about I'm going to use the word snobbery within the writing world, that there is that, and as increasingly egalitarian as it is becoming, there's still this level, and kudos to those who want to pursue that, but it is interesting to me that that's still a thing. People will, I don't know, it's funny, isn't it, that it feels so much more, if someone else has said it's okay and wants to publish your book, it doesn't matter what readers say, but as long as an agent has said, I'll take a risk on it, then it's all good. It's all good.
Well, I think that one of the things that has changed is that the authors who have chosen independent publishing and then stuck with it realize that they have to put out a product that is just as good, if not better, than the traditional publishers are. Like just recently, I've got onto a traditionally published author, and I've been binging his books, and I was getting them an ebook, and I'm like, can you guys just get a copy of Vellum, because the formatting in this ebook is just awful. And it's a big name. It's a big name publisher, but obviously, I've spoken to several guests on my podcast recently who talk about how even now the focus of traditional publishers, and these are people who are speaking from personal knowledge, the focus is on print. And so, there are areas where indie authors are doing a better job. My ebooks look better than whoever this big publisher was, and many indie authors do, because they just use Vellum or Atticus or something nice to make them. But yeah, I think it's becoming less and less apparent to readers. There's less and less of a distinction, and so I think that is really helping to erode the snobbery that
no,
as much as
definitely.
it used to be.
It is changing, and I think the quality of books that indies are putting out, on the whole, not everybody, but on the whole, are getting better and better. And the days of when you could just put anything up and the novelty value was there and people would read it, that went a long time ago. I
Yeah.
wish I'd gotten in on the ground on that, I have to admit. Life would be very different now.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I had that snobbery as well, and I was one of the many people who said, oh no, that'll never take off, that's just vanity publishing. What a mistake of the maker, hey? What a mistake to make.
we
But
all
I am
learn
interested,
and evolve.
Matty. You did say that you've stopped saying self-publishing and now you say independently publishing. What brought about that change for you?
Well, I think that self-publishing really suggests that it's something you do yourself. And in the interests of providing a professional result, you just can't do it yourself, because all the talents that are needed to put out a professional grade book are hardly ever housed in one person. We're writers, and so we produce the words. But I think it's very important that that authors who want to treat this as a business get a professional editor, because we can never look impartially at our own work, and get a professional cover designer, because people who are good with words are just usually not also equally good with visual design. And so I think that like you would never say, I'm self-producing a movie. No, you say it's an indie movie, because people recognize that there's a whole team of people behind it. And I think for the same reason, indie publishing is sets a better expectation for both the authors and the readers than self-publishing does.
Such an important distinction to make, and I think making that comparison to the independent movie world is a really good one, because people know exactly what that means. It's good
Yeah,
quality, it's just done on a smaller budget, perhaps.
exactly. And sometimes with a different goal, a recognition that maybe you're doing a movie that's never going to hit the big screens and earn back, but might be hitting the small screens, or might be something you want to share on Zoom, or is, addressing the desires of a more niche audience. And so you want to take control of it yourself and find that audience.
Lovely. Oh, I love that. Yes. So I want to talk today about the sort of craft of writing and putting together a story, because it's writing a full-length novel. It's a big project. It's a complex kind of intellectual endeavor, is what I like to say, and we each come to it in our own way, and we build our own processes. And I was reading an article that you'd written recently in which you were talking about the word outline for you is not one that you like. You find that quite restrictive. So I wondered if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about that. And I think it's that you prefer to use the term to have a frame
Yes.
for your novel. So I wonder if you would kind of share your thoughts on that with us.
Sure. So I had come to this realization that I needed something that became a frame when I was working on my 5th Ann Kinnear book. And I was on I was hoping to be able to get a novel out every 6 months. That turned out not to be true for other reasons, but this was my goal. And so I had published a book, I think in April. And so I had wanted to get the next one out in October. And so I was working on the book and had what I thought was, a good enough draft, a polished draft to give to my editor. So I gave it to my editor and he came back and liked some of it, but he had some real concerns, like the motivation of one of the primary characters. That's a problem. And so, I was thinking through that. I thought of some steps I could take in order to address that concern about the motivation. But then in doing that, I realized that it would be better if I tweaked the actions of some of the other characters. It just had this huge ripple effect. And so I didn't have to start from scratch, but I probably threw away more words with that novel than I ever had before. And when I was still working at my corporate job and it was more of a hobby, that wouldn't have mattered so much, but I'm doing this full time now. And, a delay in putting out, well, first of all, I can't put out a book where my editor's telling me the motivation of one of the primary characters is a problem. But delaying it is problematic too, because I'm taking a financial hit for every month that it was put off. And it kept getting pushed off, then it was pushed off from October to November and then to December and then January, it was going on and on as I was ripping and tearing. And there were even things like in the draft of the story I had sent to my editor, there was a woman in there who was pregnant, but just barely pregnant. So, it wasn't apparent to people who matter that she was pregnant. Then as I was reworking it, I thought, it would be more effective if she was actually very pregnant, like just about to give birth. So that in itself wasn't a huge change to make, but I had to make sure I found every place where I might have said, "Oh, you're pregnant? I didn't realize," because, it would have been silly. So there were all these little nitty details that had to be fixed every time I made any kind of change. And so I finally finished that. I think I just got it in under a year from the previous book. So I had missed my deadline by quite a bit. And I thought never again. And so as I was working on Ann Kinnear 6, I thought, I'm not going to start putting on the bright work. So you can see here, anyone who's watching, I have a poster of a sailboat there on my wall. There is nothing about the writing craft or the publishing voyage that doesn't have a perfect nautical metaphor. And I realized that what I had done is I had done the equivalent of polishing the bright work before I had the frame in place. So I was making all the words nice. I was just writing beautiful descriptions of the setting and uh, you know, drives that the characters would take or something like that. And some of that had to get thrown out because it wasn't useful anymore once I had reworked the foundation of the story. And so I like the idea of the frame as in the frame of a boat, that you don't start polishing the bright work before you've decided, what I need? It's a canoe. And, it's going to be this long and it's going to be this wide and it needs to accommodate 2 people. And I'm going to be using it on a creek, not the ocean. You make all those decisions and you build a frame for your boat that accommodates that. And then every other part of the boat building process works. Once you have the frame, then you can put on the ribs. And once the ribs are solid, then you put on the planks. And if you're in putting on the planks, you realize that the ribs are not positioned accurately, it's a lot easier to change them at that point. And so I love that idea of the frame being foundational, not restrictive. And that's why I like the word frame better than outline, because to me, outline means, Roman numeral 1, indented line A. And I didn't want that. I didn't want something that was going to restrict me or keep me from feeling like I could make changes to it. But I wanted a solid foundation. So as I built and built, it was being built on that solid foundation.
Yeah, it's such a great metaphor. And are you a sailor? Do you sail?
There was a period in my life where I was doing a lot of sailing. There's also a period in my life where I was doing a lot of power boating. I'm more a kayaker now. But I just love being on the water. I love cruising. I love looking at boats. I think, there are many, many analogies about a beautiful boat on the water being like a well-written work. just everything about the nautical world fascinates me. So I've been um, exposing myself to it where I have the opportunities.
So you've got lots of experience then of different types of boats, just as you would have that experience for the different types of stories that you're telling. I really enjoy that, and it's such a refreshing kind of image to have. Often we have the house, you know, building a house
Yes.
metaphor, but this one I really enjoy, and I love the fact that you talk about the writing voyage. It's something it's kind of magisterial, the idea of a voyage being a kind of magisterial and magical, but equally, like the road that we walk or the path that we take, it's going to take you on a journey. It's not static and it's not one and done.
Right.
So you like to build this frame, and I wonder, there's some guidelines I know for the frame that you like to build with people and for your own books as well. So I wonder if you could kind of guide us through those and your sort of process when you're writing, or if you're working with a writer.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I do is I write it in present tense. So um, I'll use the book I'm working on now, which is the fourth Lizzy Ballard book. You know, Lizzy is living in Arizona and has started gambling as a way to earn money and pay her uncle back for the money he's given her to deal with her situation. And then I'll go through and I'll do that for every chapter. I always start this out with the name of the point of view character in caps, and I even use a different font because I just find that using a different font, I use a sans serif font for my frame. It has kind of more of like a business-like look to it, and it helps remind me that I'm not here to describe the casino that Lizzy goes into in order to gamble. I'm just here to capture the fact that she's in Arizona and she's gambling to earn money. And I'll go through that. And maybe when I'm done with that, my books end up being between like 80 and 90,000 words. So when I'm done with a frame, maybe the frame is 2,000 words. And so then I'll go back and say, Lizzy is going into a casino in Arizona to gamble to earn money. She's accompanied by her godfather's brother, Andy, because for reasons that would become clear if you had read the earlier Lizzy books, it's usually not a good idea to send Lizzy out into the world unescorted. And so I'll go through the same thing, and I'll be adding another level of, adding a few tentative ribs to my frame. And then I get to the end and I might say, it doesn't really make sense that Andy is going with her. It really makes more sense that her friend Philip is going with her, because that's going to set something up more nicely, better. Now I only have, now maybe the frame is 4,000 words or 5,000 words. So it's a lot easier to replace Andy with Philip when you only have to do it through 5,000 words rather than 80 or 85 or 90. And so it's just a matter of sort of sweeping through the frame and building it up with the ribs and the planks until I feel like I've done everything I can from a plot point of view. And framing is definitely plot, a plotting aid more so than like a character development aid, until I just can't stand it anymore. And I feel really comfortable that I have a solid foundation. And sometimes when I'm going through, I'll think, oh, you know what? I've just gone to a casino to do like a little research, and there's this really great bit that I want to make sure I'm going to add. So I'm just going to add that in. I'm going to actually start adding that bright word to my craft. And so I use a different kind of font. I use a serif font. When I'm writing the actual manuscript, if you want to call it that. I'm still kind of struggling with a term to describe that stuff versus the framing text. And at some point I just find myself saying, okay, I've learned all I can from the frame. I have to start filling in more of the details. And I think that's important because I don't want to suggest to people that they should use the frame to take them through their whole process, because at some point it's going to lose its value, in the same way that, if you're using a hammer to build something, at some point, you can't build the whole thing with a hammer. At some point you have to switch to like a screwdriver or something else. So at some point I just get drawn away from the frame into the manuscript, and I let myself do that if I feel like I really have a solid foundation. And I also find that it's oftentimes not until I start writing the dialogue that I get a really clear understanding of the characters that are new to me, and sometimes do have to go back and make changes because I'm like writing dialogue and I think, I thought I could have so and so say that thing, but you know what? I just can't. I just can't see him saying that. I'm going to have to make a change. So it's not like you never go back to the frame,
Mhm.
but you can save yourself a lot of grief and heartache and time by having that foundation before you dive into the details.
Yeah, yay. Oh, I love this. So so the frame is a separate document to the manuscript that you would write separately when you start delving in.
I
So
actually write them as the same, so
ah,
that I'm taking snapshots of my document as I go. But at some point, I'll say, what in the frame might have just been, Lizzie goes into the Arizona casino. At some point, will be, Lizzie stepped out of the heat of the Arizona afternoon into the palatial lobby of, that text will replace the framing text that I've put in. Now, I still have that framing text in an old version if I ever, for some reason, wanted to go back and look at it. But I think that's the other thing that I like about the frame approach that I use, rather than outlining that it's not a separate document. It's just that the frame gradually morphs into the manuscript as it will eventually be presented to readers.
I see. Okay. Oh, I like that. So it sort of grows. It's like a snowball, and it keeps growing and
Yeah.
growing and evolving and morphing into what will be the final draft. So in that very early, when you just start putting down the initial um frame ideas, do you kind of do it scene by scene, or is it one big document at the time? And do you do it chronologically, or do you find that you jump around depending on if there's a scene that just comes to mind and you think, oh, I want to put this in at some stage?
I will sort of do a combination of those things. When I start out, I might have Lizzie is in Arizona gambling to earn money. And that might be fine for several passes, but at some point I realize, this is going to be several chapters or several scenes. There's going to be Lizzie going into the casino. There's going to be Lizzie playing poker. There's going to be Lizzie collecting her winnings and leaving the casino with whoever, has escorted her that time. And so oftentimes I'll start getting a better idea of where the scene breaks should happen as I flesh it out. And it's also helpful to me to write the scenes in the frame in the chronological order that they would take place in real life, so to speak, not in the way they will be presented to readers. And I do that because my plots tend to be sort of complex. And so I might have something that's going to be a flashback later in the book, but it's better for me to ensure consistency and logic and
Ah,
basically consistency and logic to put it where it actually happens. And then later I can just move that to where I'm going to present it to the reader. But another sort of auxiliary document I use, I'm jumping around between different tools as I need it, but I also keep an Excel spreadsheet. This is going to make some of your listeners like cringe, but I have an Excel spreadsheet that has the characters across the top and the chapters down the side. And in this example I'm using, the first line of that might be, Lizzie is at the casino gambling. And then it would say, Lizzie's happy. It basically, each cell says, what does the character know, think, and feel at the time of that scene? Each row becomes a scene eventually. So it would say, Lizzie's a little nervous about going into this environment because she's actually only 17 and she can only gamble on a illegal ID, but she's excited at the idea that she's going to be able to pay her godfather back for the money he spent. And then the Philip column might say, Philip is also happy for Lizzie that she's found this, but also concerned that a 17-year-old feels like she needs to go into a casino to gamble. And then that's nice because I can see everything that's happening to every character at one time if I look across the row, and I can see the evolution of the character through the story if I look down the column. And so it helps me catch things like, oh, Lizzie's acting like she's never gambled before, even though 3 chapters earlier we saw her gambling. And so that's also the reason that I initially do the frame in the chronological order of the world, so I can help try to catch those kind of inconsistencies.
Oh, that's so great. So, because what I'm hearing you say then is that you've got a tool that you can use for that plot side of it, and making sure that the action is happening and what's physically happening in the story. And then with the spreadsheet, then you're able to kind of track and monitor emotional their emotional journey and their emotional arc, because that I work with a tool that's quite similar to that, actually, because understanding that the emotional stuff is just as important as the plot stuff, I think, comes maybe slightly later for a lot of newer writers. And
Yeah.
I know certainly for myself, I was very, very concerned in that first book about the plot. The plot had to be fast, the plot had to have this, and this. And then it was only laterally then that I had to kind of add in the emotional stuff. It's almost like I'd forgotten about it. And so
Yeah.
sounds like you've got this with the tools that you've got. This is already, you're taking care of that, so you don't have to go back and add it in like I did. But you're making sure you've got it up front. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's really a good observation, that framing is probably more useful for people a little later on, because I do think that first work almost has to be a little more messy. And as the example, when I was writing the first Ann Kinnear book, what I had very clearly in my mind was Ann's a woman who senses dead people for a living and yet feels uncomfortable about her skill and about her need to earn money this way. I have this theme about how are people earning earning money in their lives. But and she's resentful that her client is insisting that she go into the house, even though it's the sense she gets is so terrible that she doesn't want to. And so I had that very clearly in my mind without having any idea of what had happened to lead Lizzy there, or any idea of what was going to happen after Anne, left the house in a huff. And I think it is important to maybe play around in that way to get a sense of the characters, because I find the frame useful mainly to understand the plot, and also at a high level, what's driving the people that I haven't met yet in the series. So now I know Anne, I know her brother Mike, I know Mike's husband Scott, I know the police detective that Anne often works with. I know them so well that sometimes they surprise me, but not as much as they used to. But if I'm creating a completely new character, I probably do have to muck around a little bit in their dialogue and things like that in order to understand that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got a student at the moment who is battling with that. She's writing the first book in her series, and she's in that kind of messy stage where she's still getting to know the world, she's still getting to know her characters, and she's kind of struggling with trusting the fact that she will get to know them, and she is in control of this, and it will happen. And I've been reassuring her that for book 2, 3, 4, etc., then, like you've learned, you get to know your characters, and they throw you fewer curveballs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes dialogue is the only way to figure that out for a new character.
Yes, and one of my mentors, his mentor had given him this challenge to write his whole story purely in dialogue. And he found that really, really tough, but really powerful as well. I haven't tried, I've been too chicken to try it myself, but it's definitely one in my back pocket for when I come across something that I really need to kind of dig down and get to know that person better. But really, I agree. I think dialogue is a great way into a person's psyche, and it's amazing how they then start to speak to you as themselves rather than you as the narrator talking for them.
Yep.
You said something that really interested me earlier when you were talking about your timelines, and how even if your character, say in chapter 15, has a flashback about something or has a memory about something, you will have that memory you'll write that in real time, if you like, and then move it around later. I think that would confuse me. Do you find that? I think because I only kind of remember I only have the memory as I entered that scene that I'm writing. Do you sort of is that part of your frame, is that you've kind of worked out a lot of those memories or flashbacks early on, and so you're able to place them where they should be chronologically?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of a specific example. This isn't exactly the same thing, but it might get me to an answer to your actual question. So I'm working on Lizzy Ballard 4 now, and there are 2 storylines. one of the reasons a frame is useful to me is that there are almost always two storylines in my story. So in the Ann Kinnear books, for example, there's going to be the storyline where Anne gets involved either via her sensing business or just personally in whatever's going on. But there's usually another storyline that results in a dead person that Anne is going to talk to. And so Anne doesn't appear on the scene until after that person's dead. And so I have to have something going on with Anne to get her into the story early while I'm setting the stage for this other thing to be happening. So I have to figure out a way to keep those two storylines straight in my head, which the frame and also that spreadsheet I described helps. What I found when I was working on Lizzy Ballard 4 is that at the end of Lizzy Ballard 3, so there are two main characters I'm going to be following, Lizzy, and then her arch enemy, Louise Mortensen. And so at the end of book 3, it's clear that the next time you see Louise Mortensen is going to be seconds after the last place you see her in book 3. It's just the nature of the action is it's clear that you have to pick up seconds after you see her. For the Lizzy storyline wraps up, and then there's like an epilogue to sort of give the reader a sense of closure about the Lizzy storyline, because I knew I wasn't going to be getting back to it for a couple of books. And so the first time you see Lizzy is really months, it could be weeks or even months after the last scene you see her in Lizzy Ballard 4. I'm sorry, Lizzy Ballard 3. So when I was writing the frame for 4, I was almost writing the Lizzy storyline and the Louise storyline separately until they meet up. And I was really struggling with how I was going to portray that in book 4, because it would have, if I had done it chronologically, it would have had to have been like 12 chapters of Louise before you get to Lizzy, which wasn't really good because it's a Lizzy Ballard thriller. And then I thought, okay, well, I could do kind of like flashbacks, here's Lizzy current day, but now here's Louise 3 months ago. That was feeling very kind of,
Mm-hmm.
And so I finally decided that what I was going to do is write a novella that was just Louise, that was going to take Louise from that second after her last scene in book 3 to the point where her storyline starts intersecting with Lizzy's. And then I can have them both on the same timeline and be going back and forth in a way that I think is going to be more engaging for the reader. And I think I would have eventually gotten to that if I just started writing,
Mm-hmm.
but it really would have been painful at that point to try to extract the parts of the Louise stories that I needed to extract to do the novella. So that's not exactly a flashback, but it's the best example I can come up with on the spur of the moment of that kind of writing, dealing with the chronological aspect of it.
Oh, so it feels then like you in your own mind, you needed to write that novella to fill in those gaps about exactly what happened, so that by the time the next book opened, you had those ready to go in as flashbacks when you needed them.
Well, I think I'm just going to put the novella out independently. And I think that the other thing that's tricky is trying to read this both as someone who just picks up book 4 and hasn't read the other books, and as a person who's going right from book 3 to book 4. And so I think what I'm going to do is put the novella out as like a month before book 4 is ready to launch, and say, for those of you who want to, are wondering what happened to Louise seconds after the end of book 3, here's your answer. And so people could, and then I'll seed little details in book 4 about what happened to Louise. But basically, I just have to say something at a very high level. Like, I'm not really going to have to work those novella chapters into book 4. I'm just going to have to be able to respond, or I'm going to have to include some encapsulation of what happened. But I don't think either the people who are starting with book 4, they're not going to miss it. And the people who are going right from book 3 to book 4 through the novella, it won't be enough to distract them. So it will be completely separate. But I think because she's not the protagonist, I can get away with that.
There's so many things in there, isn't there? And I think this exemplifies as well what I was talking about earlier about this being an intellectual endeavor, and all these different things as an author we've got to juggle and think about, and that it's from the reader's perspective that we've got to be always mindful of. We as the author know exactly what's happening and can fill in the gaps, but we've got to make sure we give that same clarity to our readers.
Yeah.
But also by writing that novella, then you're doing a lovely thing for your fans. They'll be delighted to have this extra story from you. And it, you know, as an indie, it's always nice to have something to tide people over with before the in-between books. So this is kills many birds with one stone. It's lovely.
Yeah, I've just finally came up with a novella idea like 3 days ago, and I think the intervening 3 days have been the most productive uh time ever. And like, because I kind of knew exactly what had to happen. I had the frame in my head, even though I still wrote it down. And also just the idea that this is going to be maybe like, I don't know, 20,000 words or something like that. It was really sort of freeing because um there's going to be less ripping and tearing, even if I make the wrong choice. It's just like a kind of fun palate cleanser. I'm really having a lot of fun with it.
It is a palate cleanser. Yes, that's a great phrase for it. I wanted to ask you a technical question about how you do this. So your Ann Kinnear books, she talks to dead people, or she can communicate with the dead.
Yep.
I've certainly come across authors who are writing, maybe not with the dead, but telepathically. So just from a sort of technical point of view, when you're writing, so say Anne is having a conversation with somebody who has passed on, how do you indicate that? Do you use italics to do that, or is it's sort of in conversation as it would be with a live person? How do you kind of differentiate for your reader?
That has changed. So in the first book, Anne's ability is much less developed. And so she has this sense of the dead person that either it's a friendly spirit or an unfriendly spirit, sort of gets a sense of their personality, but she's not really communicating with the person until the very end of that book. And so in that, I would include the parts where Anne was sensing the dead person in italics. But then as the books went on and her ability became more sophisticated and she was actually able to engage with people, it is really just like dialogue or anything with any other person. I don't use italics. I just present the conversation as if she's talking to anybody. And one really fun thing that I found, here's another like technical tip, is that if Anne is having a conversation with a dead person and there's somebody else in the room with her, like Joe Booth, who's her detective friend, then it's hard to remember that Joe's only hearing Anne's side of the conversation. And so I'll write the whole conversation and then I'll go through and I'll highlight what Anne is saying. And then I'll just read what Anne's dialogue is so that I understand what Joe is hearing. And so at the end, I always have to make sure that Joe doesn't act like he heard something that the dead person said until Anne tells him. But it's also kind of sometimes fun for humor value. You know, if I can adjust Anne's dialogue in such a way that Joe might get the wrong impression, it can be both an opportunity for some humor and also for some suspense. Like if a bad guy's overhearing the conversation, then they may assume something about the other side of the conversation that isn't really true.
Well, good tip about the highlighting. That's a very good tip. Yay. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for telling us about this and for your insider, you know, how you write as well. Because I for me, certainly I find it fascinating, and I know other people will be kind of keen to know how about your process. But if people are keen to know about your process, there's many ways they can find out about it, because I know that you do work with writers. You want to help writers get their books published, get their books finished and out there, and grow their authorship. What are some of the ways that you like to work with authors and help them?
Well, thank you for asking. Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been so fun. So if people go to the indieauthor.com, and it's Indy with a Y, INDY, there is a tab there called services. And I really focus on two different types of services. One is for authors who are interested in podcasting. I have a consulting service based on that. I also have a book, The Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors. And there, if they go to the Podcasting for Authors tab at theindieauthor.com, there is a free downloadable document that outlines the questions that I ask at the end of each chapter of the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors. And so the goal there is really to walk people through from the most strategic to the most detailed, tactical aspects of it, basically so that people don't they launch into the idea of a podcast with their eyes open, and they're matching what they want to do with their podcast, that their plan matches their goals. So if their goal is to earn a lot of money, I have some things to say about that. But if their goal is, for example, to network with their fellow writers, then they're going to take different steps than if their goal is to connect with potential readers of their books. And so it's really just the early stages of those questions and the early stages of a consult, if people choose to avail themselves of that service, is just making sure that those plans and their actions align.
Yeah, and if
And then,
anyone listening is thinking about starting a podcast, it's great fun. I think it's really good fun, and I love it as a way to connect. And it's a great way to chat to people who live on the other side of the world, and I might not normally get the opportunity to speak to. So well worth checking out Matty's resources if that's something you're thinking about.
yeah, and the other sort of similar service I offer is more generally about people's publishing voyage. And similarly, my focus is on talking with people and making sure that what they expect to get out of it is, one, realistic, and second, that the steps they take are in line with that. So an early conversation about that might be, is indie or traditional a better route for them? If they choose indie, is money more important? Is time more important? Is efficiency more important? Is creative freedom more important? Again, making sure that the path you're charting for your voyage is in line and heading you in the right direction.
Such a useful conversation for people to have with you. I think I think I'm like many who kind of fell into the water and have been doggy paddling and trying to find the way. So if there's someone there who can show me how to navigate that voyage, that boat, then it's well worth going for. So I do recommend people go and check you out. So it's at theindyauthor.com.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to link to that.
Well,
Matty, it's been lovely chatting with you. Thank you so much for your time today. I always enjoy our conversations. I'm just thinking that you market your own books, or do you is that something that you sort of outsource?
I do most of the marketing myself. And if people want to check out, to get to my social media platforms, for example, they can go to mattydalrymple.com to check that out. But yeah, that's just an evolving, what worked in 2021 didn't work in 2022, and that's just the way that goes. So yeah, the marketing approach is an evolving effort.
Yes. Well, I will try and entice you back in the future to talk about that and your experiences with social media and marketing, because that is a big part of it, isn't it? That's a big part of the journey, the voyage.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
I was just speaking to someone. I have a sort of auxiliary to my podcast called What I Learned, and I interview people on my YouTube channel. I ask them two questions. What did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow authors? And what did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow readers? And I was just talking with Cliff Beach, and he gave this great analogy about people birth their book, and they think that now, like, their work is done, they've birthed the book. And he said, you forget you also have to raise the baby. And that was his analogy too. You can't just put the book out into the world. No, you have to market it. I just thought that was a great analogy.
That is such a good one. I like that. I might steal that one.
Yeah.
Lovely. Well, for today, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been so much fun.